Hello, everybody. Welcome to Krystal, Kyle, and Friends. Very happy to be with you again this week, Krystal.
Very happy to be with you as well. A momentous week that you and I have both had a lot of feelings on.
To say the least, this has really sort of scrambled the standard teams and standard divides, and there's been a weird cadre of characters who I think are getting it right.
Yeah.
A weird cadre of characters, and basically all of mainstream media and every establishment rag you can think of, they're all getting it wrong.
Yes.
But yeah,
There's a bad bipartisan consensus. Like every media outlet that you turn to basically has the same terrible take.
That's right. Yeah, I think the only people who I've seen who have really been out front on this and really making the case as it should be made is honestly you, Sagar, myself, Michael Tracy, randomly, and Matt Iglesias. Those are the most aggressive voices I've seen on this.
Yeah, Ryan Grimm's also. I mean, there have been people who have been good for sure, but it is a moment like this when you see who has partisan blinders on that they may not even be aware of, right? And who actually is like, no, this is the principle. This is what I have stood for. I would stand for this, whether it was Donald Trump or Joe Biden, and just put the information out there. And so, I mean, it has been pretty incredible to watch the parade of like John Bolton, and suddenly George W. Bush is out there again, and Condoleezza Rice writing op-eds, and Paul Wolfowitz and Petraeus, who oversaw, the most deadly portion of the Afghanistan war, and they're all being offered up uncritically as experts that we should listen to with a straight face, which is just completely absurd.
Yeah. I've been so critical of Biden on so many things, and this is a rare instance where I think the people are just unfairly piling onto him. I think that he was also sort of misled in many ways. I trust him more than I trust the intelligence agencies, who originally were out there saying, sir, it's going to be 90 days you have to get out all of our people. And then as soon as Kabul took Afghanistan and as soon as the Taliban took Kabul immediately and took Afghanistan, then the CIA runs to their lackeys in the media and they're like, we warned him it was going to happen like right now, and he didn't listen.
Right, and and immediately that got kind of debunked. The first indication that was bullshit is just like using your brain. The second indication that was bullshit is it turns out the CIA director, when Kabul fell, was on like a 6-day Mideast swing, which would indicate to you they did not think that the collapse of Afghanistan was imminent, because he wouldn't be doing that. And then actually General Milley came out and said there was no intelligence that would have indicated that it would all happen ultimately this fast. So yeah, they're full PSYOP mode. The hawks are all out there trying. This is what disgusts me, playing on people's true humanitarian instinct,
right? Yeah.
In order to justify another unconscionable, year or 5 years or endless war that what their ultimate goal is.
Yeah. I mean, there are plenty of well-meaning people who hear like, we have to protect the women in Afghanistan, and they think like, yeah, you got to protect women's rights, you got to protect human rights. You have to do it. But if you really believe that that's the purpose of our foreign policy, I got a bridge to sell you. I mean, we don't care about freedom and democracy. I mean, we just gave multi-billion-dollar weapons deal to Israel as they were bombing the AP building in Gaza and as they were razing a Palestinian village. We just fought to get Saudi Arabia on the UN Human Rights Council. On what planet can you look at that and say, yeah, these people are honest actors who are just fighting for the liberation of people in Afghanistan?
Right.
I mean, it's ludicrous.
Yeah, well, I mean, we can just look at the history of our actions in Afghanistan to see that case. I mean, we were happy to back the Mujahideen and train Osama bin Laden.
That's right.
And funnel money through our great friends, the Saudis and the Pakistanis, that ultimately actually went to the Taliban.
Right.
So all of this post justification of, we're really there for the women and the girls. Come on, guys. We didn't go in there for the women and the girls. And unfortunately, there are a lot of horrific tragedies unfolding around the world all the time. And actually, Joe Biden, to his credit,
he made that point, right?
He made that point and made it really effectively. And the way that you bolster human rights isn't by invading a country. That's not the way that this works.
We're going to bolster human rights by violating more human rights.
Right.
And somehow it's going to work out. That's literally a contradiction that makes no sense. So anyway, we're going to have a lot more coming up on Afghanistan. That's going to be the whole point of today's show. We have a great expert on this coming on, and I'm really looking forward to talking to Matthew Ho. So before we get into that, though, let's talk a little bit about this new poll that just came out. It is, to be fair to Rasmussen poll, they are right-leaning. That's pretty clear. However, you do have to point out that in the last election, it was the right-leaning polls that happened to be most accurate. So, it is what it is. Do I think that the reason they were more accurate is because their methodology is better and they care more about objective truth? No, I just think it happened to be the case that they were more accurate because the traditional pollsters were sort of undercounting the Trump support.
That's certainly what it looks like.
So anyway, their new poll suggests that Trump would win if the election were today, namely because women and black voters regret their choice and 14% would choose another candidate. So I'll give you a little bit more on this. The total numbers, if it were held today, it'd be it'd be Trump 43% to Biden 37%.
Where are the rest of the percent?
I don't know. 51% of voters say Biden is more to blame for Afghanistan than Trump. And the poll was taken August 16th to 17th. And this latest data comes at the same time that Biden's overall approval rating has dipped below 50% for the first time.
Yeah. I mean, Trump came really freaking close to getting reelected, this last time around. And that was after effectively being responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans. And he still came within, a very tight margin in a few key states of getting reelected. So I don't think it's crazy to imagine that if you redid the election today, that, he might be able to pull it off this time because it was very narrow last time.
I think you're right, but the thing that really annoys me is this instinct where if things aren't going well, the American voter oftentimes just sort of swings back and forth between Democrats and Republicans in a mindless way. It's like, I don't like things the way they are now. Who's in control? Them? All right, I'm going to go with the other guys. Then the other guys fuck everything up. And it's like, I don't like this. I'm going to go with the other guys. And it's just like back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And nothing really seems to get fixed. And also, yes, as of right now, the reason why Biden's approval rating just dipped below 50% is because of the relentless media propaganda against him when it comes to Afghanistan. And Donald Trump's out there criticizing Biden on this front when Biden's just following through on the thing Trump said he would do, but he was too big of a cuck to stand up to the military-industrial complex and follow through on it.
Yeah.
So it's so, like, he's so disingenuous, and it's so annoying. It's like, if you were actually being principled on this, Trump and Rand Paul and Matt Gaetz and all the people on the right who pretend to be anti-war would be like, listen, on the broader point here, Biden's correct in getting out. You want to nitpick the withdrawal?
One person who's like elite Republican, a politician in the Republican Party who has had that take.
Because they're hacks.
Total hacks.
And the only one I've seen on the Democratic side, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong because there might be others, but all I saw was Ilhan Omar come out and say, like, yeah, Biden's fine talking about why you can't do endless war.
I will say they definitely haven't been, like, if Trump had done this exact same thing, almost every Republican would be out there. He would have a very strong contingent of Republicans out there going to bat for him aggressively, right? And Tucker Carlson would be, completely pro.
Don't get me started on him.
The whole thing. I mean, they'd be all in on it. There would be some dissenters. This is the one area where you'd see Republican Party. You'd see Liz Cheney.
Yeah.
You'd see Adam Kinzinger. I mean, I guess to their credit, at least they have the same bad take regardless of whether it's
Well, they're consistently wrong.
They're consistently wrong, whereas these other people, they just, like, whatever their partisan take is supposed to be, that's where they locate themselves. But, yeah, it's disgusting. I mean, I think with Biden, first of all, we should wait and see how this all settles out.
Right. I think in the long run, people will realize he was right.
I mean, I don't know, but I think that's definitely a possibility. The other thing I would say is I don't actually think it's just the Afghanistan withdrawal that's weighing on him. I also think, there's been a lot of dithering with regard to getting these next pieces of his agenda through. The infrastructure package, getting more help to people in terms of universal pre-K and the other pieces that are in the reconciliation package. You've been obsessed with this, like, bipartisanship fetish. And so his agenda had kind of gotten bogged down before we even got to that. And I think that may be weighing in on this as well.
See, he was already underwater on those fronts, though. He was already underwater because I covered a poll on this a week or two ago. The one area where he was above water and he actually gained points was Afghanistan.
Right.
And this even was when the Taliban was taking other cities and other towns and other villages. There was a lot of media coverage of that, and he still went up to 55% approval on the issue of Afghanistan. So now, the one area where he was seemingly above water, that's the area where he's getting hit the most relentlessly in the media, and that has chipped away at people,
Yeah.
and it went down.
Well, so I have a bunch of the Afghanistan polling.
Well, let's jump into that now.
Well, before we do that, I just wanted to ask you, I mean, you're of the opinion that Trump, if he runs again, could win again. Are you of that opinion?
Oh, he certainly could. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Am I making a definitive
prediction?
He will?
No,
I'm not saying that
people
at
should
all.
not write that possibility off.
No, if you write it off, you're an idiot.
Can't like wrap their head around that. But he came very close this time.
If you write it off, you're an idiot. But I also think people who are very definitive that he will win, I also think that's ludicrous. We don't know. We don't know yet. And he's not as smooth. In 2016, he was a phenomenal candidate. He was on message. He was relentless. It was all about, outsourcing the jobs, and he gave the right wing base the bigotry that they wanted with the Mexicans, the criminals, the rapists, and all that stuff, and the Muslim ban. He was more on message. 2020, he didn't know what the fuck he was doing. He didn't know whether he was coming or going. He was a mess. And so 2024, all the indications I've seen to this point are he's still a fucking mess. But lucky for him, he's not the one that's getting most of the fire right now because the media is dumping on Biden relentlessly, and that's making his numbers go down.
They've actually, so Politico, whose playbook newsletter is oftentimes brought to you by Lockheed Martin.
Right.
So, they're
I had a lot to say about
really
that.
coming from the right place on this. They were comparing Biden's speech this week, which I personally thought was excellent and honest and courageous and one of the best presidential moments I've seen in my lifetime, frankly. They described that as Trumpian. They said it was Trumpian, which is, of course, the ultimate insult. But to your point, even on this, his response to what's happening in Afghanistan, he's showing how he's really lost a step because his initial response, Trump's, was like, we got to bring in the refugee. Like, I'm worried about the refugees.
Oh, these people treated us so kindly, and they're not allowed to seek refuge? This is ridiculous.
Right. And I was like, okay, I agree.
Right.
That. I mean, like, broken clock, whatever. But the minute that he saw Tucker going in a different direction and the base going in a different direction and being like, we can have these refugees, he completely flipped and took the polar opposite position. So he doesn't know where to be anymore these days.
That's right. What he said was there was the picture that came out of the 600 Afghans on the American plane, cargo plane, and he released a statement that was like, this is ridiculous. We need to get Americans out first. America first. It's like, you just said we should get out the 88,000 refugees who are nice to us. Now all of a sudden, 600 of them are getting out. And you're like, whoa, hold your horses.
We can't have this.
So you're right. He lost a step. He doesn't know whether he's coming or going.
Yeah, he doesn't have his finger on the pulse of the base the way he once did.
Correct, yeah. And I will say this. This is something that I haven't... Only person who pointed this out was Nate Cohn, and nobody else really picked up on it. I talked about it on my show. The media was saying, oh my God, this is just like the fall of Saigon. Now, the takeaway from that wasn't, though, we should have stayed in Saigon and stayed in Vietnam forever. The reaction was like, we shouldn't have gone in the first place.
Right.
But he also went on to point out that President Ford's approval rating a month later went up.
Yeah.
It didn't go down. So even though people were like, oh my God, this is embarrassing for the United States or whatever, they didn't blame Ford.
Right.
And so my point about why I think it's going to work out for Biden in the long run is history is actually a ruthless judge in the proper direction. That's why we all, and Martin Luther King Day, everybody in the moment at the time, he wasn't beloved. People don't remember that. People don't know that. He actually had an underwater approval rating at the time because they, oh my God, these guys are causing trouble by doing these marches and everything, these radicals.
Have this.
But in retrospect, everybody realizes, oh, he was the hero in the story. Daniel Ellsberg, at the time, he was viewed as a traitor. Now he's viewed as a hero. Edward Snowden, even today, is sort of viewed as a hero, and we're not even that far removed from when his leaks originally came out.
So you think over the course of history, the truth generally wins out?
Of course.
That's a very hopeful take.
Well, I just gave multiple examples of that. That's the exact thing that happened. So I think that it is going to happen with Biden. I think that right now the media freak out, it's ridiculous. And in time, people will realize on the broader point, he's right, and we needed to get out. And that's what should have happened.
Something I've been thinking about and revisiting is when they decided to do the auto bailout, a decision that Biden was very involved with and also instrumental in touting as a major Obama administration success. But before they did it, it was really unpopular.
Right.
Like when you polled on doing the auto bailout to rescue American automakers, it was dramatically underwater. But they did it anyway because they, I guess, believed in it or thought that those numbers turned around. And that ended up being one of the core promises or core accomplishments that they ran on and won on in 2012. It was Osama bin Laden
Probably helped Biden
alive.
in his election against Trump.
This time still. I think that's probably correct, and gave him just that little bit of like favorable sort of glow and aura around him where he's able to eke out Michigan, he's able to eke out Wisconsin. I think there is something to that. So the insta judgment can oftentimes change dramatically over time. And to your point about how history, ultimately, the truth wins out, we certainly see that with the way people feel about the Iraq War now, and definitely how they feel about the Afghanistan war as well. So here's some of the polling. So part of what is interesting here is that people have a lot of mixed emotions. They're a little bit, sometimes they're contradictory, they're kind of all over the map. And a lot of what you get out of this Afghanistan polling depends on how you're framing the question. So there was an AP poll that just came out that says 2/3 of Americans, even with everything that we're seeing with the withdrawal and the ugly images and horrifying scenes and all of that, 2/3 of people still say this war was not worth it. And that's a bipartisan sentiment. So 67% of Democrats and 57% of Republicans and the independents somewhere in between. So very clear judgment on the war overall. But to give you a sense of how people have sort of like conflicting emotions about it, they interviewed one voter, Sebastian Garcia, 23-year-old Biden voter from Texas, who said, "I don't believe we should have been in there to begin with, but now that we're leaving, I do feel we probably should stay after seeing, I guess you'd say, the trouble that we've caused." So that's one response. Politico, Morning Consult, they did a poll. They found, this was an interesting one too. So only 25% of voters think that the withdrawal from Afghanistan is going well. And I think if you're looking at the images, it's pretty hard to argue that it's really going well. However, they still have a positive rating in terms of voters who think that we should be getting out. So 49% of voters continue to support the withdrawal versus 37% who don't support the withdrawal. So it's still plus 12, even though that's dramatically down from where things were back in July before we actually started to try to wrap up this very messy, ugly situation.
So, to your point, there's some just flat out contradictions. It's not even like, people are just conflicted. In some ways, people just have contradictory views. So there's another poll, couldn't find the original source for it, but you see the table, it's originally from a PDF, which is why I'm having a hard time finding it. I think it's Economist, but I'm not 100% sure. But listen to these questions that were asked back to back. To what extent do you support or oppose the following? America sending combat troops back into Afghanistan to fight the Taliban. So in other words, that's like, should we reinvade and go back to war? Okay, ready? 50% support that. 36% oppose that.
That's terrible.
Now, wait. The very next question. America completing its withdrawal of troops on schedule. 61% support us doing that, and 25% oppose it. So that means there are people who said both, we should go back in there and fight the Taliban, and also we definitely should stay on schedule and withdraw our troops. So there's some stuff that's just flat out contradictory. Now, let me do my whole spiel on this, because this is something that really, really, really pisses me off. To the extent that anybody's conflicted or people have contradictory views, the only reason why we're there is because their entire media is full of shit, and it's lying to them every step of the way. We have neocon war hawks who are being held up as if they're experts on this when they're war criminals who should be in The Hague. I'm talking about people like Ari Fleischer. I'm talking about people like John Bolton, who they're talking to as if he's some sort of neutral, objective arbiter of the truth, which is absolutely insane. But then you have the liberal interventionists who are just as bad.
Yeah.
People like Jake Tapper, who are nitpicking the way in which this is going down. And that's the other thing. Even in the polls, people are conflating the process of how we're getting out with the general idea of should we get out.
Right.
Because if you ask just the general idea, should we get out of Afghanistan, it's overwhelming on the side of get out. But then you can conflate it and make it sound, messy and make it sound more split when you phrase it in a way about the process of how we got out. Like, is the execution going well? And it's a way to try to gin up this war fever again. Mm-hmm. That's what it is.
Yeah. And
nothing pisses me off more, because I remember back in, I think it was like 2013 or 2014, there was a poll that came out, and the war in Afghanistan was more unpopular than Vietnam at the height of its unpopularity.
Wow.
It was under 20%. If I'm not mistaken, the number was either 19% or 13% support for the war in Afghanistan. So that's where Americans are. And the problem with the media on this front and the problem with the propaganda is this. Because some people would say, Kyle, I don't know, they're just reporting the facts on the ground. So how can you be upset about that? They're just telling people exactly what's happening. Here's the problem. It's selective emphasis. So as we pull out, all of a sudden, the microscopes come out. Everybody's looking at every little nook and cranny of what's going on, and everything's hair on fire coverage. This is crazy. Everybody go nuts. Oh, my God, look at what's happening. Isn't this terrible? They didn't have 1/10 of the level of scrutiny for all the shitty things that happened when we were there. When we bombed a hospital in Kunduz, and we killed, I think it was 23 civilians. Was there hair on fire coverage over the course of a week about that? Oh my God, we're killing civilians. What are we doing? We're protecting people from the Taliban? In this way, we're killing civilians just like the Taliban. What happened? We bombed a wedding. What about that? We dropped, what's the number? Over 7,000 bombs in 2019. Civilian casualties shot through the roof. We broke a record in civilian casualties just a couple of years ago.
Yep.
Where was there hair on fire coverage for this? When the Pentagon, not the Pentagon Papers, the Afghanistan Papers dropped, it was in the news for less than a day. And what did we learn? They lied to us every single step of the way.
That's right.
Every step of the way, but it wasn't a big scandal. They didn't talk about it. So selective emphasis is the problem. There's lies by commission and there's lies by omission. If all of your scrutiny and all of your outrage is saved only for when we draw down, but you didn't say anything about the fact that our allies were warlords with child sex slaves and people in the military got discharged when they blew the whistle on that, I don't want to hear your fucking opinion if you weren't outraged about the stuff happening when the war was going on. And that's the entire media. So they're dupes to the military-industrial complex, either wittingly or unwittingly. I don't care what the purpose is. They're either idiots or they're nefarious and they're doing it on purpose. I don't care what it is. Either way, don't trust them. They're liars.
They are pretending like they care about Afghan lives now, when, as you point out, the deadliest year for Afghan civilians was 2019.
When we were there dropping bombs.
Because we were dropping so much.
Right.
I didn't see a single segment on that.
Nope.
Not one, okay? Maybe there was one, okay? I didn't see it. I didn't see any coverage of it whatsoever. You had to really dig deep to know that was even going on. So all of these people now running around pretending like they're great humanitarians and they just care so much about the women and the girls. We didn't go to Afghanistan because of the women and the girls. I mean, it's a ridiculous notion. And so they try to manipulate people who are good people, who do care that we try to do the right thing around the world and try to protect people. And they're manipulating those good instincts for the nefarious end. And what is the nefarious end? Well, ultimately, that $2 trillion that we spent in Afghanistan, the estimate I saw is that, we had this whole fairy story about, oh, they're building schools and they're building infrastructure and the girls' robotics team and all this stuff. 80 to 90% of that ended up in the pockets of Beltway military defense contractors. That's what this all ultimately was. You want to know, why did we stay for so long? Why were we so unable to extricate ourselves long after anything resembling the original mission had long been over? It's because of the number of people who were making so much money off of it. And then they have those same people on now uncritically as like panelists and experts to deride the Biden administration for actually doing the thing that should have been done literally decades ago. Matt Iglesias had a good tweet on this that I will read, which says, "Did Biden make the right call in Afghanistan? We asked 27 former senior national security officials now working as defense contractors whose work there failed on every level. Their verdict, definitely blame Biden and not themselves and keep the money coming." Why? Because they need you to think that this messy situation that is unfolding before our eyes in Afghanistan, that's the real problem, versus the real problem being the 20 years of death and of corruption and of unconscionable and the lies that were told to the American people time and time again. They need you to ignore all of that and believe that, oh, this all would have been fine if we had just issued some more visas ahead of time or just stayed another month longer. Then it all would have been fine.
Ask yourself this question. Ask yourself why you don't know the following fact that I'm about to let you know. You know who we backed very recently in Afghanistan? The Taliban, because they were fighting ISIS. And so we used them to fight ISIS. In the same way that in the 1980s, we armed the Mujahideen because the Mujahideen were fighting the Soviet Union. In the same way that right now we back Saudi Arabia and we back Sunni militias on the ground in Yemen who are fighting the Shia Houthis who've taken over the government, and we don't want them to take over the government. You know who those Sunni militias are? Al-Qaeda. That's who we're backing. So ask yourself, all this selective outrage, oh my God, women's rights, this and that. Why has the media not told you that we've allied with jihadists? We've allied with the Taliban. Why have they not told you any of that? Because it bucks their narrative, and it's inconvenient. And so they don't tell you the truth. And, I mean, you got to the heart of it right there. The real reasons were there. A lot of it has to do with imperialism. A lot of it has to do with geopolitics and controlling a region of the world that we consider vital. We want to keep China at bay. We want to keep Russia at bay. It has to do with the trillions of dollars in mineral wealth that's there in Afghanistan. We don't want anybody else getting their hands on it. We want to be the ones who have access to it. And it's about military-industrial complex profits. And you've set up this gigantic network of grifters who are getting phenomenally wealthy off of us being there. And so we're there. And, you know, here we have a president who, for the first time in my lifetime, put both middle fingers up to the military-industrial complex, put both middle fingers up to the establishment and the leadership of both parties, put it up to the deep state, the CIA and the Pentagon, and nobody's defending him. Nobody's defending him. And instead, they're nitpicking the process by which we get out. Do I have criticisms as to how we got out? Of course. Would I have tried to get out the 88,000 people who are our close allies? I absolutely would have. Am I saying there's zero criticisms that you can make? Of course not. But if you're not stressing the main point, which is that on the overarching point, Joe Biden is correct, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear the nitpicking of the process because guess what? Like you said, if we left a year from now, if we left 5 years from now, if we left 10 years from now, if we left 30 years from now, Afghanistan was still going to fall and become Talibanistan. Kabul was still going to fall, and it would have fallen in 11 days, whether it's now, 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years in the future. So you know, as a matter of fact, the media was always going to say, not like this. I'm in favor of you getting out, just not like this.
Right.
But if this is going to happen no matter when we get out, then you're actually never in favor of getting out. Now,
Right.
are you?
Well, and the real black pill is actually, if we had gotten out long ago, we're in a much better position because what happened? The people that we were backing were such like corrupt criminals, abusive criminals, that it gave the Taliban a chance, who we had effectively destroyed, a chance to reconstitute and have these propaganda wins about we need to get the foreign invaders out and these corrupt kleptocrats out. And that allowed them to build genuine support because the people that we backed for so long were so incredibly terrible.
Ghani, the president, the puppet president of Afghanistan, who we put in there, there are reports now that when he escaped to Tajikistan, he left with over $150 million in cash.
Bags of cash.
So what are we fighting to uphold here? That's what we're fighting to uphold?
And that's the thing that does kill me. And Biden does do this, and it does annoy me, is he's like, the Afghan army wouldn't even stand up and fight for their country. Like, you gonna fight for the dude that just fled with $150 million in cash?
They're right to not fight for their... Right,
yeah.
Exactly. They're right. I'm not making a value judgment.
Yeah.
He's correct that if there were 300,000 of them and they had the most modern weapons in the world, yeah, they didn't really have the will to fight. But they shouldn't have had the will to fight.
Yeah.
You know, there was maybe 1,000 or 2,000, this Vice News documentary, I watched laid this out. Elite fighters who did care and were fighting. And, you know, God bless them. But, yeah, what are you going to fight for a fake country and a fake project like that?
Right.
No, you're not going to do that.
You're going to fight for the glory of the, warlord with the child sex slaves that we allied with? Is that who you're going to pick up arms and put your life on the line for? I don't think so, and they didn't think so either.
Now, again, I'll say it one more time. Everybody out there, compare the conversation we're having right now to anything you see on CNN or MSNBC or Fox News, because we are on different planets when it comes to this. And I think that says a lot about just how objectively terrible they are.
I think that says a lot too. The next voice that we'll have on, you definitely are not going to hear on any of those platforms. Matthew Ho was a Marine. He deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. He also then worked for the State Department on the ground in Afghanistan. He was, let me get his title here, former senior civilian representative for Zabul province. I'm not sure if you say that right, but Zabul I'm going with. He's now senior fellow emeritus at the Center for International Policy and a member of Eisenhower Media. And back in 2009, surge era under Obama, he resigned from his State Department post and effectively said, I can no longer associate myself with this war, in a letter that you now go back and read was incredibly, incredibly prescient. So excited to speak now to Matthew Ho. Matthew, thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me here.
So I was just telling our audience that you resigned from your post with the State Department over what you saw as an effectively unjustifiable war in Afghanistan in a letter, your resignation letter, reading it back today from 2009 was quite prescient. But the key piece here, you said, to put simply, I fail to see the value or the worth in continued U.S. casualties or expenditures of resources in support of the Afghan government in what is truly a 35-year-old civil war. Just share with people and take your time in telling this story, how you came to this place and what made you decide to take what was a pretty dramatic action of resigning from your post there.
Sure. Well, thank you for this opportunity. So I initially went in the Marine Corps in January 1998 after college, and I was involved in both in the Iraq War twice. Once as a Marine Corps officer in charge of a company of Marines, and then another time as a Department of Defense official on a State Department reconstruction and governance team. I also was involved in Iraq policy and operations from Washington, D.C. And because I have worked with the State Department, including having been on the State Department's Iraq desk, I had the opportunity in 2008 to be appointed into the Foreign Service and to go to Afghanistan as a political officer. At that point, I was not linking the two wars as I should have. I really, at that point, believed that these wars were separate in many ways, much as if I was, I understood U.S. history. I understood the imperial and colonial aspects of American history. I understood the United States as an empire, but I failed to connect all the events from the past, going back to say the wars against the Native Americans, the Spanish American War, the Mexican American War, on and on through Vietnam, through Central America. I failed to connect that with what was happening. And so it took me going to Afghanistan to see the reality that that war was fundamentally no different than the Iraq War. Yeah, you can make comments, you can make points, you can say the terrain's different, the people are different, the culture is different, but the only thing that mattered was that the U.S. military was occupying Afghanistan and the United States was trying to achieve military victory in the midst of a civil war. Now, this was a civil war, of course, that the United States instigated and sustained, back in the 1970s. But it was certainly a war that the United States had jumped into in 2001 and decided that the path to victory was solely through military means. I had thought very mistakenly that the United States in 2009 under Barack Obama would be conducting the war in a manner that would try to achieve a political solution. Certainly that was what was being said in 2008. That's what General Petraeus says in the fall of 2008 when he takes over Central Command. We are going to pursue a political solution. There is no military solution in Afghanistan. Barack Obama says more or less the same thing. But as soon as Barack Obama comes into office, the strategy in Afghanistan is one of military victory. And after getting to Afghanistan, April of 2009, again, seeing the war was no different than the Iraq War. At that point, I was already morally and intellectually broken. I was going through tremendous mental health issues because of the war, because of moral injury, because of post-traumatic stress disorder, because of what's known as perpetration-induced traumatic stress. By the time 5 months came around, seeing what I saw in Afghanistan, the same I had seen in Iraq, there was no way I could go along with the escalation of the war, particularly, in fact, because the war was counterproductive. Everything we did with the war in terms of trying to fight the Taliban harder only brought the Taliban more popular support. The United States in both of these wars, as well as throughout its history, pursued a divide and conquer strategy. And with that divide and conquer strategy, it just simply pushes people to insurgent groups and extremist groups, because if you're on the wrong side of that divide and conquer strategy, you have no one else to turn to. You have an existential threat against you. And that's what I'd seen happen with the Sunnis in Iraq, seeing happen with the Pashtuns, as well as just the wastefulness of the war, the futility, and the lies of it, the absolute lies and fabrications, the myth, the narratives, all the things that sustained the war, that kept it going, that got American political and public support. Just complete lies, myth, fabrication. So after 5 months of being there, I resigned in protest, as I said, over the escalation of the war. And yeah, here we are 12 years later.
So, Matt, I just watched this documentary from Frontline called Obama's War the other day, right after Kabul fell. And it was really interesting to watch because they were on the front line basically with U.S. troops, and this was back when the Taliban was basically limited to Helmand province. And what became very apparent to me is the strategy at the time was like, well, the American soldiers are going to try to separate out the Taliban versus regular Afghans, and then try to create relationships with those regular Afghans and like turn them against the Taliban. And of course, the Helmand province is where all the opium is basically grown, or the poppy is grown. And as I was watching it, it became clear to me that because of, cultural differences and because of the mission and the fact that the U.S. soldiers were there with all their gear and their big guns, and you saw the interaction between the Afghans and the Americans. The Americans, at least in this documentary, were very forceful with these, goat herders and farmers. Yep. And the Taliban had the strategy of getting in with the communities and asking them if they needed anything, and in many ways, they were vicious and deployed primitive justice, but on the other hand, they also brought a sense of law and order. So I guess my question is, when you were there, did you get the sense that we were in the process of effectively trying to nation build, and did you get the sense that it was a futile effort from the very beginning?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the unit I was in, my first role in Afghanistan when I showed up was the embassy sent me to the east to be the acting political advisor for a U.S. Army brigade. And so in that capacity, I was a senior civilian, the senior political officer for 4 provinces in eastern Afghanistan. And I did that for a couple months before going down to the position I was originally meant for down in the south of Afghanistan, where I was the U.S. political advisor for a province and a senior civilian for the entire south of Afghanistan as well. And the unit I was on, the unit that I helped lead in Afghanistan and Zabul province, was called a provincial reconstruction team. I mean, that was the focus of effort for not just the Americans, but for all of NATO in Afghanistan, was these provincial reconstruction teams. So the idea that somehow the United States was not nation building, it's just a complete lie. I mean, I think that is when President Biden said that, both in July, he said that it was not about nation building, and then again this past week when he said it was not about nation building, the affront, I think, to the million or so American and NATO veterans of the war and their families who have dealt with this war and who are still living with the effects of this war, the affront to them to so casually lie about the reason for the war, what they were actually doing, why they were killing people, why they themselves were being killed, why they were coming home maimed, why they were coming home with traumatic brain injuries, why, all these things, for the President of the United States to so easily lie about that. Not once, but twice, because he said it again in July and he got called out on it. And then him and his people said, you know what, we're still going to say this because we have to cover ourselves. I think that is maybe the best encapsulation of the lies of these wars, how easy the lies are, why the lies are important, because it's not just, Kyle, it's just not just about the details, about the lying about how many girls went to school, which is a complete lie, about the number of healthcare centers we built, which was a lie, about the life expectancy rates of the Afghan people, which was also a lie, not lies about we're making progress, we're defeating the Taliban. Those lies are very important. But I think the most important lies are the lies about why we were there, the narratives for these wars, the things that feed into that Manichaean good versus evil struggle, that America is a force for good, that what we are doing over there is helping the Afghans, what we are doing over there is protecting America from another attack. Those are the lies I think that are the most important. And those are the lies that, because those are the lies that have stained these wars, those are the lies that have continued these wars, the lies certainly started these wars in many ways, because again, this war does not begin September 11th. This war begins in the 1970s, instigated by the United States. So, I think when we look in terms of when people say things about what the United States was doing there, you have to understand that, the honesty that's being addressed with that, there's an ulterior motive. There's a reason why people say things, and it's for political purposes. And I think the best understanding of this, right, is the work the Washington Post did with their Afghan papers. If people are not familiar with the Afghan papers, December 2019, the Washington Post, after 3 years of court battles with the U.S. government, receives the interviews of more than 400 officials, senior officials, both military and civilian, who have been involved in the Afghan war since 2001. And what the Post states quite clearly is that the war in Afghanistan was one big systemic lie. The Post uses nicer language than I do. They'll say things like they hid the truth. But the reality is that one big systemic lie. Yeah. And if you understand that, and to even go further on the point that the Post makes, the Post then says the reasons for these lies were nothing more than to support the domestic political priorities of the White House, whether it be a Democrat or Republican in office. And I think that is the most important thing we can understand about what the United States was doing in Afghanistan and why it was doing it, and why Afghanistan is in the situation it is now.
So I want to back up to your personal experience again, because we both have talked quite a bit about the Afghanistan papers, and I think you're exactly right. What it really exposes, I mean, there are quotes there of them just blatantly admitting that they cooked the books on the statistics to persuade the American people that progress was being made, when in fact the polar opposite of that was the truth. You have people casually admitting that they don't know why the hell they're there, that they're really, nobody could possibly define the mission. Nobody knows why this thing continues to go on. Of course, we know the truth, which is a lot of people were making a lot of money off of it, so that was a big part of the reason that it was going on. But what was your personal experience with coming to grips with the public perception and what you had been sold and in some instances bought into in Afghanistan, and the reality once you arrive? What was the first indication for you that, oh, this is not the thing that I thought it was ultimately going to be?
Sure. And my rationalizations for being involved in these wars change over time. I think a lot of us understand that we have dualities to ourselves. We do, why we do things oftentimes are in opposition to what we actually believe, because we have pressures, within us. So when I first take part in the Iraq War in 2004, I understand the Iraq War to have been not a mistake, but, a criminal enterprise. But at that point, I think, I can make a difference. I can go over there and I can make a difference. By the time I get home a year later, I realize that's completely absurd. But then I make the excuse to myself, well, you know what? If I stay involved, and when I came home from Iraq, my first time, I went to work on the Iraq desk at the State Department. If I stay involved, when I become a senior official, then I can make a difference, right? And then that doesn't seem to make sense anymore. But then at that point, I have the opportunity. I was a Marine Corps reservist, a Marine Corps reserve officer. I have the opportunity to mobilize and take a company of Marines and sailors to Iraq. And then it becomes, well, I'm a pretty good officer. I'm a better officer than other guys I know. If I go, I can make sure a lot of these young men come back home to their families. I mean, so I think a lot of us, we keep rationalizing and making excuses. And I want to say, I think the story I told a lot when I came back from Afghanistan and to try and explain the war there was in 2009, the most dangerous place, the deadliest place for American forces in Afghanistan was a place in the Kunar Valley called the Korangal Valley, which many people might remember because in 2009 it was being celebrated across American media. It was on the cover of Time magazine as the Valley of Death, et cetera, et cetera. And Admiral Mike Mullen, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, came to visit. And we went up to the Korengal and he said, "What are we doing up here? And what would happen if we left?" And the first answer was answered from the 2-star level down to my level. Nothing's going to happen. If we leave the Korengal, nothing is going to happen. And that's precisely what happened after we left the Korengal about 2 years later. Nothing happened. The second question was harder. Why are we here? So myself and another guy, we got the responsibility of finding out how the heck did we ever end up in the Korengal? And, because the official explanations for the United States being in the Korengal, and if people don't remember, the Korengal Valley is where, if people remember the Navy SEAL who wrote the book Lone Survivor, that Mark Wahlberg was in the film, Marcus Luttrell.
Yeah.
That story, a lot of problems with that story, but that happens in the Korengal, right? The idea that they're going in there because there are all these senior level Al-Qaeda people in there. That's what the American public is being told about this, that there's this connection between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, the connection between these villagers and Al-Qaeda that we have to root out, we have to be there for. Well, I call the unit that had previously been in Afghanistan. Why were we? Because I asked the guys in the Korengal, "What are you doing there?" "I don't know. We came here because the guys before us were here." I call the previous unit, got the same answer. Previous unit, got the same answer. I finally make my way down to the first guy who brought his troops into Afghanistan, actually a Marine. And because everyone else had said, "Oh, we were here because the unit here was here before." And I said, "What were you guys doing there?" And he said, "Well, we had just kind of arrived in that area, and it seemed like a good place to set up a base camp, right? It's a good place to set up a patrol base because it was in between certain locations." And I said, "All right, well, what happened when you guys were there?" He said, "We were there for 8 months and nothing ever happened." And then you piece it together. What then happens is after he leaves, we bring in the Afghan National Police. And the importance of this of understanding is to understand Afghanistan and what we were entering into, and how our ideas about the war being about 9/11 were so far removed from reality. The Korengal Valley is about 15 or 20 miles long, about 3 or 4 miles wide. These people speak their own language in the valley. They speak Korengali. They never come out of the valley. Their major trade is timber trade. And even when they move their timber to be sold to Pakistan, the majority of the time it's picked up by timber traders and taken to Pakistan. They barely leave the valley. These people had no connection to Al-Qaeda. They had no ideology of jihad or anything like that. They just want to be left alone to live the way that generations had lived before. What happens is in the United States' strategy of counterinsurgency, which begins well before General McChrystal supposedly brings it to Afghanistan, the United States is going to bring in, because I think you have to look at this, what happens in Afghanistan as a really a neoliberal nation building experiment that comes out of the neoconservative thinkers who populate and dominate the Bush White House and the Bush Pentagon, the Bush State Department. So what we do is we bring the Afghan government into the Korengal because that's what we believe they need. And these people are not from the Korengal. These people are not even from the East. These are the people that have been fighting against the people from the East for more than a couple of decades now. And we put them in and we say, "This is your government. These are your police." And then what do they say? The police say to the Korengalis, they say, "These trees that you all have been cutting down, that your grandfathers cut down, your great-grandfathers cut down, that you live off of, they don't belong to you. They belong to the Afghan government, and you have to pay a tax on them." And so you can understand that how the stories we're telling ourselves about this war, the myths about this war, the idea that somehow this war is about 9/11. No, what we are doing is we are trying we have intervened in a civil war. We have taken, again, a civil war of our making, but we've taken one side out of power. We have put the other side into power, and we have chosen through a divide and conquer strategy that we will have a military victory. On top of that, you have this neoliberal experiment. When I was in the State Department in 2005, I was on the Iraq desk, but certainly familiar with what was happening on the Afghan desk. And the crisis that was occurring was that Hamid Karzai was being called the mayor of Kabul. And for those within the administration who come out of particularly the Chicago school, right, who are very, proponents, neoconservatives, proponents of nation building, proponents of making nations in the image of the United States because it's best for them and also best for the American empire, this is an anathema. This is an affront. This is a real insult to the American project in Afghanistan, and that must be fixed. And so what you then see is starting in 2005, 2006, NATO expanding the war, which culminates with the Americans expanding the war in 2008, and then Barack Obama really accelerating the war. But understanding that we were pursuing a strategy of divide and conquer, where we were giving the people in Afghanistan two choices: the choice between a repressive theocratic government and a repressive kleptocratic government. You have, I mean, the genesis of the Taliban themselves, they come out of the Mujahideen who fought the Soviets. But by 1994, the civil war in Afghanistan is brutal. It is causing incredible harm to the Afghan people. Warlords are in power all throughout the country, and they are just preying on people. And the origin story for the Taliban is that they rise up against the warlords in Kandahar and overthrow them. And then, according to the Taliban's version of this, the people join them and they become a popular movement. There is some truth to that. The thing that it's important for Americans to understand about this war is that the person who was the head warlord in Kandahar was a man named Gul Aga Sherzai. He brutal, trafficking young boys, all the stories you hear, this is him. He was the person the Americans put back into power in Kandahar. I mean, so that idea that somehow we were going to subjugate the Pashtun people, that we were going to defeat them, and that throughout this process, by the barrel of our rifles, we were going to force Afghans to pick one of two terrible choices. I think that gets very dramatically unveiled to me when I had experiences like going to the Korangal and seeing it for myself. Or actually, I actually never got into the Korangal, but being a part of all that kind of stuff, right? Because then you see that throughout. Again, I served in 5 different provinces and saw this being replicated over and over again. To your point, Kyle, about what you witnessed in that documentary, absolutely. The U.S. Marines and the British who are in Helmand, they're an invasion and occupying force, but so are the Afghan police and soldiers who come in there. In my province I was in, we had 8 Afghan army battalions. Of those 8 Afghan army battalions, and there are 2 major languages in Afghanistan, Dari and Pashto. And Pashto is what the Pashtuns speak, and in a province like Zabul, 99% of the people speak Pashto. In the province I was in, where 8 Afghan army battalions were, where only 3% of the soldiers were Pashtuns and came from the south or east of the country. The rest were composed of the people who the Pashtuns had been fighting before. Of those 8 battalion commanders, only 2 spoke Pashto. Only 2. I mean, so they were about as worthless as we are in terms of talking to people. They were as much as outsiders as we were. So I think I've got 1,000 stories I can tell like that, but I'll run my mouth as long as you guys let me. But so let's move on.
Let me interject for a second. So when you look at Iraq, for example, one of the big takeaways for me is the goalpost moving in the story that we're told. So originally we're told Saddam worked with Osama bin Laden and worked with Al-Qaeda. Then the goalpost moves when we learn that that's BS, and it's, well, Saddam has weapons of mass destruction. And of course, the implication that they're trying to make is like, he has weapons of mass destruction and he might use them on us. So trying to scare everybody on that front. That's absurd. And then eventually we finally land on, well, Saddam is just a terrible dictator. Now, that's true, but what they don't tell you is during the height of his atrocities, we were backing him and arming him. So that's the dirty little secret. But in the case of Afghanistan, what was the reaction among the troops that you were with? Because in 2009, our own intelligence comes out and says there's less than 100 operative Al-Qaeda members still left in Afghanistan. And then by 2011, we kill bin Laden, and that's in Pakistan. So fundamentally, by 2011, the original arguments that were made to the American public about why we're in Afghanistan, check and check. Mission accomplished. So was there a sense among everybody who was on the ground in Afghanistan like, okay, can we declare victory and come home now? Or what was it like on the ground?
Well, yeah, I mean, hey, I think about 800,000 Americans who were in the Afghan war, so lots of different perspectives, right? But I think what you get to, and one of the things you saw in these wars were so many Marines and soldiers in the ground combat units doing repeat tours. Sometimes not out of their own volition, right? Because this is just the way it's working out for them, and the United States is just sending them over and over again. I mean, at the height of the Iraq War, Marine infantry battalions were spending 7 to 8 months in Iraq, 3 months back home, and then back in Afghanistan 7 or 8 months later. I mean, that was the tempo that they were under. I think many of them are there because of their buddies, because of the other guys in their squad and their platoon, and you see a lot of that. What they do is for each other, and that's not uncommon. I think most memoirs, most discussions of veterans in war, that's what comes to, is that it is about the people to your left and your right, the people in your squad and your platoon. That's why you're doing this. I think that there is a great misunderstanding, though, of why we are there. In 2006, when I was in Iraq, and I'm glad, Kyle, you're bringing these together, because I don't think it's possible at all. I think it's a mistake, actually, to try and disentangle these wars. And the same thing, too. We have to speak about Afghanistan as we speak about all of the U.S. wars in the Muslim world. I mean, the United States is waging war from the west coast of Africa all the way to Pakistan. And that is one world war in the Muslim world that the United States is conducting, and to try and pull out the various wars and put them in their own boxes and to dissect them individually, I think, again, we'll be missing the picture. But when I get to Iraq in 2006, I was just reminding of this, that at that point in Iraq in 2006, a poll was done, and it found that 80% of Marines, soldiers, airmen, sailors, et cetera, in Iraq believe that they were in Iraq because Saddam Hussein was connected to 9/11. I mean, that had been disproved for years at that point. But I mean, so I think there is I think people would be shocked to know the number of soldiers and Marines who went to Afghanistan or went to Iraq who had never even read an article, a magazine article, a foreign policy article, whatever, a Time magazine article about Iraq or Afghanistan, let alone read a book about it. So the idea that people in the military are kind of looking out and taking in the big picture, it's just really not the case. They take care of one another. This is the job they have signed up for. This is their career. This defines them. Particularly in the Marine Corps, there's a very influential book in the Marine Corps called This Kind of War by T.R. Fehrenbach. It's about the Korean War, but the parallels to what he writes, I don't like what he writes, but they're accurate in describing the Marine Corps as similar to the legions of Rome. And many men and women in the U.S. military adopt that view. And I think you can see that best shown through the generals that Donald Trump put into charge. Jim Mattis at the Defense Department, John Kelly, who was Homeland Security, who then became Chief of Staff, and H.R. McMaster, who was his National Security Advisor. These are men who, unlike the neoconservatives under Bush, the Kalazads, the Wolfowitzes, et cetera, these are men who do not believe that it is purposeful or even necessary to try and rebuild these societies. These are men who believe that these parts of the world are the frontiers of the empire. They are the borderlands, and they must be subjected and kept down. That the rebellion, the challenge to American authority must be met with violence. And if you're familiar with the CIA and the special operations community, you will have heard the phrase mowing the grass. Mm-hmm. The idea that we have to consistently be over there mowing the grass to keep the people down, to keep control. If we do not do that, it will rise up and we will be in trouble. And that type of thinking descends down to the individual Marine and soldier level. And it's also prevalent too, because the books that the Marine Corps and the Army do recommend now to read kind of go along with that thesis. These are books written by celebrity generals and celebrity journalists that really provide look, when I was a young officer in the Marine Corps, I had to read books by General Giap, who was the Vietnamese general who defeated the Americans, Che Guevara, Mao Zedong. I mean, the Marine Corps reading list in the 1990s was totally dedicated to critical thinking towards the Marine Corps into the wars. If you look at that Marine Corps reading list now, it is just completely written by, just sycophants and fools and liars.
Wow.
But that thinking, and who writes that? Who writes those reading lists are generals like McMaster, like Mattis, like Kelly, like Petraeus, like McChrystal. So that type of thinking, get your point, Kyle, about what these young men and women are thinking there, are influenced that way. But you cannot, the problem is reality is smacking you in the face. And I think that is one of the issues that we see with the high rates of combat veteran suicides. We do not have data on exact numbers of combat veterans versus deployed veterans. We do know that the order of magnitude of suicide in terms of veterans deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan is much higher than veterans who did not deploy to Iraq and Afghanistan.
Wow.
And compared to the general public, if you are a young man or a woman who went to the Iraq or Afghan war, your chance of death by suicide is 6 to 14 times greater than a civilian your age who did not go to the wars. 6 to 14, right? I mean, and what we know from all the research, dozens of studies have been done at this. Don't listen to people like Sebastian Junger. They have no idea what they're talking about. It's not about because people missed the war. It is because of the guilt, the shame, the regret. It's something known as moral injury as well as perpetration-induced traumatic stress. And we know this because the VA has studied this for decades now. Since 1991, the VA has reported the best predictor in combat veterans of suicide is guilt. So your point, Kyle, is that you believe these things, right? You're told these things. The books you're told to read reinforce these things, right? You get out. You're out of that bubble. You're out of that groupthink. You're out of that environment. You're out of that support network. And now you start to think about it. It doesn't make sense. The stuff you heard over and over again, well, it just keeps being true. Why do these generals have to keep saying every year progress is just around the corner? You know, they said that last year. They said the year before, as well as, too, if you dig into it and you realize that, what are we doing here? There's a story. Oliver Stone and Peter Kuznick had the book Untold History of the United States, which I recommend to everybody. And then Showtime did a documentary series on it. There is a story that DVD box set went around a Marine battalion in Helmand and caused such distress, anger, despondency, because these Marines were learning about the nature of American imperialism, about how this war is connected directly to that. And this is what they're taking part in. That the officers ordered that those DVDs be confiscated.
Wow.
I mean, that's what you're talking about here.
Wow.
Yeah, because the understanding, again, as I said earlier, I didn't get it. You know, I mean, the continuity of history, what we are taking part in is no different than what had been done before. 100 years ago.
We see the propaganda in full effect in real time right now, and the way people are being convinced and persuaded that, that you can have John Bolton go on TV and, pretend to care about Afghan women and girls. Like, what a joke. I mean, this is pure insanity, but it's wall to wall, that type of coverage right now. Another thing I wanted to get from you, Matt, is what's the role of the drug trade in fueling this conflict?
So let's go back to the beginnings of this war in the 1980s. At that point, Afghanistan produces poppy crops, but they are predominantly internal consumption. They don't produce enough to export. The CIA and the Pakistani ISI, the Pakistani Intelligence Service, and at that point, because the British had brought the crop into India, and India at that point had included Pakistan, right? So there are poppy crops in Pakistan. The American CIA and the Pakistani ISI bring that crop into Afghanistan in the 1980s to produce for export in order to help fund the war against the Soviet Union. The men who own those crops are the warlords who the United States has put in power since 2001. More importantly, when the Taliban come to power in the 1990s, by the time September 11th has come by, the Taliban has reduced, they didn't eradicate it, but they reduced the poppy growth in Afghanistan to a level where there was really no exports. It was insignificant. The Americans come in, we put back into power these warlords who own these poppy fields, or who used to own these poppy fields, who have become wealthy off of it. And now, of course, and for most of the last decade, because it grows, but for, at least since 2008, 2009, Afghanistan has provided 80 to 90% of the world's illicit opiates. Anytime anyone says, well, what's this war got to do with people here in the United States? I don't really think the war in Afghanistan affects us here. Well, we just had 93,000 people die from opiate overdose last year in this country. 80% of the world's opiates are consumed by Americans. There is a very real connection between that explosion in opiate growth or poppy growth in Afghanistan and the consumption of opiates, not just in the United States, but around the world. So I think that's a good example for people to understand how these wars affect us here at home, how they do come home. But one of the things, a story I can tell you all about, the man I mentioned before, Gul Aga Shirzai. By the time I get to Afghanistan, he is in Jalalabad, the same city I was in, and he is the governor. And Jalalabad, Nangarhar province is where Jalalabad is, and Jalalabad and Nangarhar control the most important border crossing for Afghanistan, what's called Torkham Gate with Pakistan. So this is a very lucrative position. But anyway, we have this program. It's called the Governor's Eradication Program. And the idea is that we're going to give cash money. We, the United States, are going to give cash money to these governors to get them to eradicate the poppy crops. Gul Aga Shirzai's family still has vast swaths of poppies in Kandahar down the south. He's up in Nangarhar. So what does Shirzai do? He goes to the poppy growers, to the drug lords in Nangarhar, who are also allied with us, by the way. But he goes to them, he shakes them down. He says, either you cooperate with me or I'm going to eradicate your fields. And those who call his bluff, he goes to the Americans and turns in those fields, and those fields are eradicated. So what do we do for shaking down his fellow drug lords, for consolidating his share? For increasing his share of the drug production in Afghanistan, right? For rubbing out his competition, we give him $10 million cash. I mean, that is how the American war on narcotics unfolded in Afghanistan. Wow. The lie that the Taliban was the driving force behind the drug trade in Afghanistan was exactly that. Certainly, yes, there are Taliban involved with the drug trade. Of course, the drug trade is the only industry in Afghanistan. That's it. So the Taliban, of course, are going to be involved to some degrees. They're going to tax. They're an insurgency. They're going to tax whatever they can tax. They're going to tax the drug trade. However, the major players, the drug lords, the people who have controlled the Afghan drug trade for these last 20 years are the U.S. allies. When I was there, the biggest drug lord in Afghanistan, because he controlled the drug trade in Kandahar, was President Hamid Karzai's brother, Ahmed Wali Karzai. Ahmed Wali Karzai was the governor of Kandahar, which is the second most populous province, second largest city in the country. And he was the largest. And that was the man who was in charge of he was the Scarface of southern Afghanistan, and he was our ally. I mean, so understanding those kinds of lies, because so much during that time, you heard about the narco-terror nexus, right? This connection. And again, yeah, the Taliban were involved in the drug trade. These last several years, some of the heaviest fighting you've seen in the south of Afghanistan has been trying, one side or another, trying to gain control of the poppy fields in the south. That's why some of the violence has been so bad. But yeah, the understanding of who the Taliban actually are, and to make it even more nefarious, Krystal and Kyle, to really show how the United States is involved in this, why the United States is involved, the lies of it all. Yes, the Taliban got a significant part of their income from the drug trade. However, of their major funding sources, that was number 4. The third most important revenue stream from them was from siphoning off American contracts, right? Either even contracts directly or shaking people down. I used to go visit these small outposts in the middle of nowhere in Afghanistan, totally surrounded by Taliban. You'd ask these kids, these lieutenants and captains who were in charge of these posts, how much do you control? And this is in 2009, remember, and it never got better. They would say, we control what my machine guns can reach to. That's it. The Taliban control everything else. Wow. So why didn't they get overrun? Well, there's two reasons. One is because of American air power. The Taliban never really wanted to mass their people because they'd be attacked by our attack helicopters, our A-10s, our B-1s, et cetera. The other reason, though, is because all these little bases we had out there, every year we're spending $1 million or $2 million to build wells, build schools, buy, whatever, and who was getting that money? The Taliban commanders. Their brothers were the ones who were the contractors building the schools. I remember in the province I was in, we were wondering why the school teachers weren't getting paid. Well, it was because the guy who was in charge of schools for Zabul province, his brother was a well-known Taliban commander in Wardak province. Where do you think that money went to? So it was like that type of thing. So getting back to the funding sources, that's number three. Number two, and it's kind of, I guess, arguable, at least when I remember the intelligence from this, from what I could observe and understand and read from our intelligence and our own assessments in the American government, was that 2 and 3 kind of at the same level, support from Pakistan, right? Of course, who we are supporting. So we're supporting Pakistan.
Our ally, yes.
Our ally, right? That whole thing. But the biggest supporters for the Taliban throughout this war that the United States has been in have been the Gulf monarchies, by far. The Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Kuwaitis, that is the biggest support for the Taliban. Ties in very nicely with what we know from WikiLeaks, right? Because, in WikiLeaks detailed very clearly in cables from the State Department and notes from Hillary Clinton and other people, top people at the State Department, that the major funder, the biggest supporter of al-Qaeda and Sunni terrorism was Saudi Arabia. And
so the Taliban's greatest funding sources, just to encapsulate it, are our allies, our contracts, and the opium trade that we helped to start.
That's right. And we sustain that our allies own. Exactly. Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah, that really is incredible.
I mean, there's a good saying in the peace movement that doesn't necessarily tie into this so much, but in terms of the whole economic activity of war, that even losing wars make money. And if you understand that, I think you can understand how this continues to be propelled.
That's right.
Well, it's the case that in the United States, every single state has jobs tied to the military-industrial complex, which shows you perfectly how even otherwise well-meaning Democratic senators who say the right things, being anti-war, at the end of the day, they're like, not the Honeywell jobs in my district.
Right.
You know what I mean? Right. So horrible, horrible situation. Let me ask you this. When you look at like the real reasons why we're there and the real reasons why we do what we do, I noticed this week that it struck me. Now you might disagree, and Matt, you might disagree. I don't know, but it struck me listening to Biden talk about like how we need to get out and why we're getting out. It struck me that he actually sort of maybe believed the cover story to some extent about why we're there, and he said he even opposed the surge when Obama, proposed the surge, and apparently that's documented at the time. He was even public about that. So do you think that there's like a mix among our elites in terms of who really believes the cover story that we're fighting for freedom and democracy and human rights and women's rights, and then there are the ones who are the elites who sort of know that it has more to do with military-industrial complex profits and China and Russia and natural resources? What's your sense of that?
Well, let's first go back to Biden's opposition to the surge, because that's simply not true. Joe Biden supported doing what he called a counterterror strategy in Afghanistan. When Barack Obama comes in office, there are 30,000 U.S. troops there. By the summer of 2009, there are 70,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan. The United States then has the surge debate in the fall, which culminates in Barack Obama going to West Point in December of 2009 saying, I'm going to send 30,000 more troops. Joe Biden's plan was to send 20,000 more troops. That's Joe Biden. That was Joe Biden's opposition to the surge, was he was going to send 10,000 less troops to Afghanistan than Barack Obama did. There are moments where Joe Biden is quoted as saying things. I mean, Bob Woodward's book, Obama's Wars, which I can't recommend enough to people, no matter what you think about Woodward, he does show some things quite well. And in that, Biden is quoted as saying, you don't have to do this. But I think that's in the context of Biden believing this counterterrorism strategy, which, again, was only 10,000 less troops than the 100,000 troops the United States had there. And the counterterrorism strategy that Joe Biden also brought up in his remarks the other day was carried out by the United States. So after General McChrystal gets fired, which I'm I'm not a big Barack Obama guy, right? I mean, but I'm very proud of Barack Obama for firing General McChrystal. We have a very serious issue with civilian control of the military in this country. If people are concerned about where our democracy is going, I think we need to look and see how the United States military has been dealing with senior civilian leadership these last few years. That's a very dangerous path we may be on. However, Barack Obama firing McChrystal, very proud of the man for doing that. The General Petraeus takes over. General Petraeus then says we're shifting from a counterinsurgency strategy to counterterrorism strategy. The only difference was the United States expanded its rules of engagement. The United States went back to bombing villages with our aircraft, particularly with our drones, and the United States launched a real effort, not a real effort, but a very heavy, serious night raid policy, where every night U.S. commandos were landing in anywhere from 15 to 25 Afghan villages in the middle of the night, kicking in doors, shooting people. The idea was that we were going to terrorize the Afghan people into supporting us. There was some motion about we're going to fracture the Taliban leadership by this, but there was no evidence that would ever work. Policymakers knew that. The idea behind a counterterrorism strategy was to terrorize these people so that they would stop supporting the Taliban. That's what General Petraeus put into action in Afghanistan while he was there. It failed just as miserably. So on both aspects, what Biden said about that, opposing the surge, and we should have done a counterterror, both of those are wrong, because he didn't oppose the surge, and we did try a counter-terror strategy. So again, it kind of gets back to the point, the ease that people lie about this and about the predominant nature of the war, the lies about it. Why did the United States go into it? Well, the United States was already involved in Afghanistan because, again, you can't say that Afghanistan starts on September 11th, 2001. You have to go back. You have to go back to 1979, even earlier. The Afghan war is a living legacy of the Cold War. That's and all the decisions that the United States made that are what influences the events that happen now. We think we have free will, but so very often we are really restricted in our choices because of the events that came before.
I just want to be clear though. So the sense I'm getting is that you think pretty much all of the elites know the real reasons why we're there, and none of them are actually sort of duped by the cover story. Because my sense of it was that among some of the elected leaders, they might genuinely feel one way or another way about the war, but really it's the deep state who runs the show, and it's the CIA and it's the Pentagon. So that's not your sense of it? Your sense is that like all of them sort of know the real reasons why we're there?
No. I mean, I had enough experiences on Capitol Hill that, I'm happy to talk about and share. I go in to meet Ike Skelton on St. Patrick's Day 2010. Ike Skelton at that time from Missouri, Democrat from Missouri. He was the chair of the House Armed Services Committee, right? So the person who is in charge of oversight for the people of the United States of America towards the military. I give Ike Skelton my opinion on Afghanistan. And Skelton says to me, again, the chair of the House Armed Services Committee says, I have never had a negative briefing on Afghanistan before.
Wow.
This is in 2010.
Wow.
I meet with Adam Smith in 2011, who at that point, because Skelton loses re-election, so Adam Smith at that point, who is the, I guess he's the ranking member, or maybe second ranking, second a Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee, regardless. He says to me, I know the generals come in here and lie about it, and there's nothing I can do about that. I go and I see Jack Reed at one point. And Senator Reed provides plenty of time to me, has a great conversation. And at the end, as his aide, his foreign policy advisor, is walking us out, she says to me, look, we know there's a discrepancy between the intelligence, between what's really happening there and what the generals are saying. But we don't feel it's our place to get in the middle of that. Senator Jack Reed, who is, I don't think he was at that point, he was, the number one or two Democrat on the Senate Armed Services Committee. And not just Democrats. I remember being in the green room at MSNBC back in 2011, and Michael Steele, the former Republican National Committee chairman, says to me, this had happened, this was the summer of 2011, President Obama said it's the right thing to do is to leave Afghanistan, because at that point he wanted to begin his drawdown from the surge in the summer of 2011. Michael Steele says to me, he says, you know what? And so Michael Steele came out and said, President Obama's right. The chair of the RNC says the Democratic president is right about the war. Michael Steele, and if you remember Michael Steele, you remember he was always putting his foot in his mouth. He was always saying things like, "Got right." I mean, he wasn't and he says to me, "This is the most this is the most anger I have ever received being in this job." Wow. He said he had dozens of Republican congressmen, House members, congressmen and women, House members and Senate members say to him, call him, send him emails, whatever, say to him, "Look, you might be right about this, but you can't say that."
Wow.
I mean, and I could go on for a long time with stories like that, so it comes down to either they're too dumb or they're in on it. Another aspect I think that needs to be understood is that I remember meeting with Senator Casey's staff, and actually the person I met with was a U.S. Army major, and he was upset about this. He was upset about one thing in particular, that the briefings that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee received and the Senate Armed Services Committee received, according to him, 7 out of 10 of those briefings came from not the State Department, not the CIA, not the Department of Defense, but from think tanks funded by the defense industry. So organizations like Institute for Study of War, Center for New American Security.
Which, by the way, they have a guy who goes on Fox News all the time, Jack Keane, used to be in the military. Now he's directly funded by, because he works for the think tank that I think you just named. He's funded by them. He always is going on Fox News and always giving his opinion on war. His opinion is always pro-war, and they don't even bother to disclose that this guy is paid, by defense contractors.
And he's on the chair. He's on the board of directors for one of the top 5 defense contractors. I can't remember which one, if it's Raytheon or Lockheed or what so, but or whichever. But absolutely, you hardly ever see that. So this idea that our elected officials are not receiving information on the war from our own government, from the Department of Defense, from the State Department, from the CIA, but they're receiving it from organizations that are, not just funded by the defense industry, they're funded by the fossil fuel industry, by the banks, on and on, because, you start to get into that conversation about the relationships between the defense industry, the fossil fuel industry, the banks, the media. As you guys know, that's a really great conversation to have, but it's very complicated in its telling.
I do actually, so I want to ask you about the media. Like, as you're watching the coverage of Biden's withdrawal, and you see all these people who suddenly care deeply about the Afghan people, even though they didn't give 2 shits 5 minutes ago. How are you viewing that, the narratives that are being spun, and how should people be viewing the coverage that the media is putting out there right now?
Well, I think they should be, critical thinkers about it, to put it politely, or skeptics or cynics. Look, the same people who suddenly care about Afghan lives are the same people who are totally cool with keeping kids in cages down on our borders. I mean, they're the same people. The idea that somehow the United States was ever doing anything to help the Afghan people is just another lie. Look, if some crumbs fell off the table of the occupation of Afghanistan and some Afghans picked them up, hey, great, get a video camera over there. That's a good news story. Put it on CNN. But the United States occupation was never meant, even though we were doing nation building. Look, the United States military has a doctrine called money as a weapon system. The purposes of the nation building were for the purposes of the United States, not to benefit the people of Afghanistan. The idea that somehow we improve the lives for women in Afghanistan, yes, for some women in certain neighborhoods of certain cities, life has dramatically improved. For men, it has dramatically improved because of the occupation. But you have to remember, 75% of men and women and children in Afghanistan live outside the cities. So for them, for those living particularly in the areas where the war was, their most pressing concern every day was whether or not they, their families, their children, their neighbors, et cetera, will be killed by, a bomb put in the side of the road by a Taliban, or the bomb dropped from the sky by the Americans. It's very similar to, talking to Iraqis about it. They'll say, yeah, Saddam was terrible, but you know what? At least under Saddam, I never had to worry about my children being killed by a car bomb while they're walking to school. I mean, like, so, the disillusion from that. And then the idea, again, yes, there are women who benefited over the last 2 decades. The majority did not. Look, under this Afghan government, this warlord government that the United States put in power and has kept in place, as many as 4 out of 5 Afghan women are forcibly married, many of them child brides. All right.
Yeah.
If you're an Afghan man, you can legally rape your wife under Afghan law. And the major reason, the majority of women who are in Afghan prisons are not in prison because I guess they're all, they're probably not let out now. I mean, the Taliban supporters were let out. I guarantee these women haven't been let out because the majority of women who are in Afghan prisons are in prison not because they were Taliban supporters, but because they committed moral crimes. And let me make sure everyone understands what moral crimes means. Moral crimes means that if you're a woman who is raped, you go to prison. That's what moral crimes mean in Afghanistan, as well as in places like Saudi Arabia and other places. So, and we can go on and on. We can talk about how the Afghan government routinely tortured. As many as between 1/3 and half of all prisoners in Afghanistan were tortured. Depends upon who picked you up. If you're picked up by the army, 1/3 chance to be tortured. Picked up by the intelligence service, half of the people they picked up were tortured. We could talk about the child trafficking. Look, the child trafficking, this is not that Pizzagate nonsense. This was very real. There were U.S. Army officers who saw the child trafficking among Afghan government and military officials as a real thing, as a systemic thing, as something that was very obvious. Rather than doing something about it, the U.S. Army chose to punish several Army officers who stood up to say, this is wrong. I'm working with a commander here, just as I worked over there with a commander, and there's a commander over there doing the same thing, who are raping boys daily. That's the Afghan government that the United States has been keeping in power for these last 2 years or 20 years. So that kind of helps you understand why the Afghan people this last year, and especially these last few months, have said, you know what? If I've got to choose between this theocratic, repressive government and this government of warlords like this kleptocratic repressive government, you know what? I'm going to give the Taliban a chance again. Doesn't mean they're going to become card-carrying members of the Taliban or anything like that, but just the fact that right now the status quo is so untenable for so many Afghans that the Afghan government is the villain, not the Taliban, that the Taliban were able to utilize that type of mostly passive support, but that influences all the warlords who switch sides. That influences the soldiers who walk away from their posts and go home. And, ultimately, this is how the United States loses this phase of war. And I want to make sure if we're talking about this phase of the war, potentially what can happen with this this peace, which is a very cruel, unjust, unfair peace. But maybe now there is the hope, if the cycle of violence is abated, if it's diminished, maybe there can be some rebuilding and reconstruction. But there's the other aspect of this where right now, I promise you, Kyle and Kristen, Kyle and Krystal, there are people in Washington, D.C. who are looking at Afghanistan saying, you know what? This isn't much different right now than it was on September 10th, 2001. Taliban control most of the country. Their support is pretty minimal. They only control it because that's the way that the civil war has shaken out. They were less evil than the other side was. That's why they're in charge now. But so there are men and women in D.C. who are saying, look, it's same as then. Taliban control the country. There are warlords opposed to the Taliban who we have been allied with for decades, who are holed up either outside the country or in certain parts of the country. Look, we can do again what we done in 2001. This time we know better. This time we'll do better, right? And now you get into all the hubris, the arrogance, the ignorance that drives American foreign policy. And so that's why I think we're in a very dangerous place. Right? Or not we. I'm fine. I'm sitting here with my dogs, drinking my coffee. It's the Afghan people who are in a very dangerous place. Yeah.
I think that's all really well said. And one piece that you raised there that you won't hear anywhere is the media leaves this impression like we made it amazing for women and girls in Afghanistan. But we only see the success stories. We only see that, small percentage that has done tremendously better and great for them under the U.S. occupation. Any of the backsliding, any of the fueling of the drug trade, any of the cruel warlord, like that part, we don't see so much on the television. So, Matt, thank you so much for bringing this perspective to our listeners and viewers, because it's one that, frankly, you're going to hear in very, very few places.
Thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you for the work you guys are doing.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Matt, tell everybody where they can find you. I don't know if you want to plug anything, maybe a Twitter account or wherever you're at.
Yeah. I actually got back on Twitter just a few days before all these events in Afghanistan started to happen. Right? Yeah, because that's what's best, Krystal and Kyle, for my PTSD, my
For your
traumatic
mental
brain
health.
injury,
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
substance abuse. Yeah, jump right on
Twitter.
Twitter.
That's
right.
what everybody says. Yeah.
The best thing for your mental and emotional health. Right? So I'm on Twitter again. It's Matthew Piho. You can look. I've got a website that I don't update very regularly, MatthewHo.com, and then I belong to the Center for International Policy. I write for Counterpunch at times and other places. So yeah. But feel free, people. Anyone got questions or want to chat about anything? And hey, if there's any veterans out there who are listening to this, having problems, family members of veterans, friends of veterans, hey, you can find my email address on my website. You can contact me on Twitter. You can get me on Facebook. Please reach out, because other people I reached out to other people. They helped me, and this is how we all get through this. So please feel free to do so.
That was Matthew Ho. Some phenomenally interesting and revealing stories from his experience. And I think the big takeaway from him is just the radical distance between what people have been fed year after year after year, what this was about, what was happening on the ground, that we're the good guys and they're the bad guys, and it's all very clear cut, and the reality of what he and so many others actually saw and experienced.
Yeah, when we invited him on, I sort of expected him to, speak to the personal angle of war and his experiences on the ground. But the fact of the matter is, he did that as well as he's basically a historian of the wars that he participated in.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, he said a lot of stuff there. I like to think I'm relatively well read on these wars, and his knowledge just blew my knowledge right out of the water. Like he had stories that I never came across them before, never read a single article about them.
I mean, I should have known that the CIA started the drug trade in Afghanistan. Like, I should have just assumed that, but I didn't actually know the specifics of how that all unfolded. So that was pretty revelatory. And then also him delineating exactly where the Taliban is getting their funding and how we are either directly or indirectly complicit in all of those methods. And also, yeah, one of the other lies that we've been fed is like, oh, yes, some of our people, they do some of this drug trade stuff. But the Taliban, they're really funded by the drug trade, when it turns out, no, actually, the ones we're allied with are the kingpins who run way more of the poppy fields than the Taliban, actually.
Yeah, I don't know how anybody could listen to that interview and then walk away saying, like, it was good that we were there, or we should stay.
Or
any of
I
that
can't
stuff.
understand why the Afghan army didn't fight for their country. That line, like,
Well,
what, you're going to fight for these warlords and
to
the
his
dude that
point-
took off with $160 million?
To his point, it's basically a fake country. You know what I mean? You have these very disparate, fractured, factionalized areas, and you have some different languages and different cultures, and it's just not, to think of it as one unified thing is misleading.
Yeah, I mean, there is a very proud civilizational history in Afghanistan that is complex, and it is multi-ethnic, and it is tribal, and this is a crossroads in many ways, has always been strategically important, which is why empire after empire has tried to exert their control there. But, I mean, look, the bottom line is, the whole thing was ill-conceived from the beginning. It took on a life of its own because of the money that was being made. People were lied to routinely, and that gave it a life of its own, too, because no commander-in-chief wanted the American people to actually see the truth. And what we've seen with the Biden withdrawal is that now people can just really plainly see the truth. And that as cynical as you and I were about this war, the reality was even worse than the greatest critic could have possibly imagined.
Yes, for sure. And yeah, just to that point, I just looked it up now. Yeah, of course, the British Empire played a big role in drawing the border for Afghanistan. When you look at the Iraq border, same thing. Western powers had a direct, line in creating that border, and it's striking when you think about just how much negative outside influence has impacted not just the Middle East, but also Africa, You know, you listened to a book recently that went into the detail on that, and it would blow people's minds when you think about it. Like even just we were just talking about Afghanistan, but even Iraq, the way it's divvied up, again, it's like a fake country. You had the Shia population was the majority, about 60%. Sunni population is 40%, and the reason why Saddam, he was such a brutal dictator, he was part of the Sunni minority, and they oppressed the Shia majority, and then also he was vicious towards the Kurds. It's like, you look at that, and sure, you could say people have their agency, and they can make their own decisions and all that stuff, but you can't deny the colossal impact of the outside influence, whether it's drawing the borders or being involved in drawing the borders, or the drug trade, which is facilitated oftentimes by the West, or us propping up warlords.
Whatever. Yeah. Some Cold War. I mean, so many of these. Iraq also has a Cold War history that's relevant. Afghanistan, same thing. Obviously, in our funded the Mujahideen, which leads to Osama bin Laden, which leads to the Taliban, just to fight the Soviet Union. It really is dark when you go into the history of like country after country and realize, oh, we fucked this place up a long time ago.
And think about it. Again, to make a point I made earlier, how much of this stuff is the media talking about, like mainstream media?
Well, he said Matt made the comment of like, you can't just pretend that Afghanistan didn't exist before September 11th. But that is, in fact, the general approach of the media is nothing in, and actually, most of them, that's like the best of the coverage where they go back to track the history of the war. Most of them right now, Afghanistan didn't exist until like 5 days ago. That's the only part that they actually seem to care about.
No coverage. I remember screaming about this on my show all the time. I would cover Afghanistan whenever I got anything, print outlet or wherever, I would get a story and I'd cover it. I'm like, they never talk about a war that's still going on. I wouldn't be surprised if, like, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, if at times during the war in Afghanistan, they went literally a year without mentioning the fact they were still at war. I wouldn't be surprised. There were giant swaths like that.
Well, because their sons and daughters aren't the ones fighting it. And for all of their moral preening now, they don't actually give a shit about the Afghan people. And, you know, and then you wait until, if we do have Afghan refugees who come here, which I hope that we do welcome as many as we possibly can, then they're going to take a right-wing perspective on the introduction of refugees into the country as well. So, look, they just carry water for the military-industrial complex. They're part of this Beltway circle that, bottom line, has gotten fabulously, fabulously wealthy off of this war and so many other wars before them. What was Matt's quote? He said, even losing wars are profitable, something like that.
Right. Yeah.
And nowhere has that been more true than in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I like that quote of his. I also like, he said, you can have a repressive theocracy or a repressive kleptocracy. It's like, oh, that sums it up so well.
And you add on top of the repressive kleptocracy is also a bunch of foreign invaders.
Bunch of foreign invaders, warlords with child sex slaves.
Layer that onto the whole analysis for people, because I think the idea that there was some concept worth fighting for here is patently absurd. It's patently absurd.
Yes, and don't believe any of the media bullshit. I mean, I don't know how, I can't stress it enough. They're just terrible in every way. What I learned this week is that I actually hate mainstream media even more than I hate our politicians, which is, I mean, that's a bold statement, but that's really how I feel at the moment.
Segment after segment is just disgusting.
It really is.
And have they ever said a word about the women and girls in Saudi, for example, or the famine in Yemen, or any of this?
Very obvious points to you and I, that never occurs to them. There's a genocide going on in Yemen and a famine going on in Yemen, and we're backing Saudi Arabia as they do it. We even aided them with bombings and whatnot. Didn't say anything about that. Don't say anything about, even Biden made this point. Look at what's going on in the Congo. Look at what's going on in Sudan. The point I always make is look at what's going on with the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar.
Yeah.
There's all over the world this stuff is going on.
And it's horrifying.
Yes, and they only hone in the one area where they think they can make the point of, we need to intervene more. We need to stay there. Not like in Yemen where the idea is just don't actively facilitate the bad things, where it's like, if we do less, it's better for the people in Yemen.
Yeah.
So they don't look at it like that. It's atrocious. But anyway, on that note, let me do a shameless plug for everybody. If you like, the show that we're doing here, You can always support us on Substack. You tip us $5 a month, and then you get the video of this show, and you get it a day early. If not, that's okay. We still love you, and you can get the audio version, the podcast version of the show for free a day later. But as I always mention, we take $0 and 0 cents from advertisers on this show, and we've even gone above and beyond in the sense that we turn off the YouTube ads when we put this on YouTube. So we've really made a point of only raising through small dollar donors. So we greatly appreciate anybody and everybody who donates to us and enjoys the show. And yeah, we want to make sure, I mean, even if we're the only show that does this, I'm sort of proud of that, and I want to stick to our guns. You know?
I totally agree with that. And obviously the reason that we find this platform important is so that we can have these longer, in-depth conversations with people like Matthew Ho, who you're going to have trouble finding him,
Correct.
Certainly in this extended format anywhere else. So we appreciate you guys. We love you guys. We got another great guest for you, planned for you next week, so you don't want to miss that.
Oh, that's going to be a good one.
Enjoy your week, everyone.